this now?
Yes.
No.
Happy Halloween. I may have written this video a while ago. Werewolves are, of course, one of the all-time classic monsters, standing as a key component of what I like to call the Big Six. Zombies, vampires, mummies, ghosts, witches, and of course, werewolves themselves. Fortunately, this collection of creatures and ghouls are nowhere near as malicious as the actual Big Six. These monsters have been featured in countless shows, films, novels, songs, and Halloween parties, and by now we've established a pretty vivid cultural idea of what exactly a werewolf is. Howls at the full moon, vulnerable to silver, blah blah blah, you know it all already. Yet, despite this shared consciousness, I can't help but feel that they're frequently done wrong. So today I'm looking at the history of werewolves and how they're presented in popular media to get to the core of why I feel that they haven't fulfilled their full potential as monsters of the night. Oh, on the topic of spoilers, I should let you know that whilst there is a risk for each of the fiction texts that I'll be discussing, this will usually be regarding the fact that there is a werewolf to begin with, and how they look or act in a more general sense. So for the most part, you can probably still go in blind after watching this video. Probably. I'll do my best. Either way, I'll list every text that I mention in the description below, so I'd advise you to have a look there right now if you're really concerned about spoilers. Now,
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
so let's take a look at the history of the werewolf. Each of those unholy creatures that I mentioned earlier has a long history based upon real-world superstitions and, more often than not, genuine beliefs and fears. Zombies as we know them are commonly understood to be derived from Haitian folklore and the fears of a type of walking dead, people whose lives and consciousness were stolen so that they could be made into thoughtless slaves freed only from ideas of rebellion. Vampires were considered to exist by many across Europe and the United States for centuries, culminating in perhaps the most famous case in Rhode Island in 1892, when the corpse of a 19-year-old Mercy Brown was exhumed and her heart and liver removed, burnt to ashes, and fed to her brother for fears that she was a vampire causing the tuberculosis that plagued her family, despite her being the third person to die. Mummies of course follow on from the ancient Egyptian beliefs that dictated the mummification process, which was believed to enable the dead to live well into the afterlife, hence the popular image of former pharaohs rising from their sarcophagi. And I'm not sure that I need to explain how ghosts were frequently considered real given that so many still believe in them today. Though it is notable that in the past they were often seen as physical forms like in Hamlet, complete with the wounds that caused their deaths, or as smokes and vapours, such as are described in Homer's The Iliad, far from today's entrenched ideas of apparitions and poltergeists. But whereas those four are all examples of our fears that death might not be permanent, the two that remain, witches and werewolves, are fears of living people with demonic characteristics, and as such, both have extremely dark and disturbing histories. The persecution of alleged witches is well documented, and associated with the events at Salem or the cruel methods of supposed witch finders such as the infamous Matthew Hopkins. They reek of overzealous religious superstition, and the barbaric torture that was enacted upon those undoubtedly innocent women is sickening and terrifying to many, even almost 400 years after the majority of the incidents occurred. And if those have ever made you feel squeamish, then you might want to skip over the rest of this section, because the fates of those punished for being werewolves aren't all that different. Apologies in advance for the mispronunciations, but as a quick overview, from 1591 to 1595, Volkert Dirks, his family, and two others were on trial in the Netherlands after being accused of lycanthropy. He and his daughter, alongside two others, were executed, whilst his four sons, aged from 14 down to just 8, were whipped. This punishment was predominantly based upon the confessions of Volkert himself, who was tortured until he admitted to his crimes in big quotation marks there, after his 13-year-old son had confessed to being a wolf. The year that those trials concluded, and just 40 kilometers away in Arnhem, Johan Martensen was executed, strangled and burned at the stake due to similar accusations and, likely, a terror whipped up by the prior case. In 1651, Hans the werewolf, a teenager in Estonia, was executed for crimes that he had supposedly committed during his childhood. The next year, Jan Vindervogel and neighbour Jus Verpret were both tortured and burned as two of 6 men executed in the Spanish Netherlands from 1589 to 1661. 5 years after their deaths, Matthias Stoop was executed for similar crimes. The last known werewolf trial, according to Elmar Laurie's compilation of 280 cases, took place less than 3 centuries ago in 1725. The most famous werewolf trial, however, is surely that of Peter Stump. Peter Stump was a roughly 54-year-old man who was mercilessly executed for the reported crimes of using a magic belt to transform into a wolf, killing livestock, communing with the devil, practicing black magic and incest, and murdering and cannibalizing 2 pregnant women and 14 children, one of whom was his own son. Of course, it's possible that he committed some of these acts. However, Stump, as with so many accused of being witches and werewolves, was confessing whilst being tortured, so even the accounts of feasible crimes are questionable at best and at worst entirely fabricated. Nonetheless, the man, his daughter, and his reported mistress were tortured to death, with the woman being flayed alive, strangled, and burned, whilst Stump was bound to a wheel, having flesh torn from his body with red-hot pincers, followed by his limbs, which were then broken with an axe whilst he was decapitated and burned. His severed head was placed atop a pole containing the torture wheel and the figure of a wolf. Stump's story may not have contained the curse of the full moon, or the silver bullet to lay the beast to rest, but his execution has had a huge impact upon the eminence of werewolves in pop culture. Its brutality and the sensational nature of his alleged crimes led to a pamphlet being produced and distributed throughout modern-day Germany. This pamphlet was so popular that it was published in multiple countries and at least 2 languages, as the only known surviving version is an English document produced in London. This seemingly sparked werewolf terror across Europe and even led to the executions of other people for crimes that they couldn't possibly have committed. The first widespread werewolf story was shockingly true. Peter Stump and his family were tortured to death, and werewolves have been a prominent figure in popular media ever since. But despite this initial reaction, they have become welcomed in recent decades. Because whilst the werewolf was a relatively recent phenomenon at the peak of their literary popularity, and still represented the remnants of contemporary terror as the first werewolf film emerged in 1913, we today see them as nothing more than fictional creatures like fairies and unicorns. Like witches and vampires, they are generally taken more jovially, partially due to our greater understanding of the world, and perhaps partially due to the fact that the demonization assigned to them has shifted towards the deification of serial killers as similarly unnatural, impossible, and overwhelming beasts. But that's another video. This disturbing history is hidden behind a third factor. We don't find werewolves terrifying because we don't find the films that they're in to be terrifying. Not that I'm suggesting that we should all become paranoid killers like what happened after the publication of Stump's trial and execution, but there is definitely more terror and intrigue to the werewolf myth than we are currently experiencing as a culture. So let's take a look at how to make the most of the monsters themselves. Probably the most important part of any Wolfman story is the dynamic between the wolf and the man. I mean, I guess they don't have to be a man, but I was just going by the classic film title. And also the fact that they never seem to not be a man. Anyway, it's become an essential component of werewolf fiction that the character the most horrified by the werewolf's actions is the werewolf themselves in human form. Whether they lose consciousness during the transformation or can remember the horrific details of their killing sprees, the person who acts as the wolf's clothing is almost always going to feel dull if they're not a sympathetic character who feels agony over every person or thing that they consume in their animal form. This is in large part why 1941's The Wolfman became the definitive werewolf film, even though there had been lycanthropes in the movies for almost 30 years at that point, and there was a mainstream Hollywood film 6 years earlier that featured a werewolf akin to the modern idea in Stuart Walker's 1935 picture Werewolf of London. Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance as the titular Wolfman gave viewers an insight into the torment suffered by the unwilling host, and cast the same sympathetic light upon the werewolf that still shines brightly today. Furthermore, the contrast between the wolf and host make fertile grounds for budding ideas and philosophies, with the opportunity to expand this Jekyll and Hyde dynamic in a manner that is representative of the clashing of other binary oppositions. The good human and the big bad wolf are an unstoppable force and an immovable object, sympathetic and villainous, human and animal, high society and feral beast, protagonist and antagonist. And this fundamental opposition can stand as an allegory for endless, futile struggle between any two factions or ideas. It's how Werewolf of London became an American werewolf in London, and how Ginger Snaps reflects puberty as a collision of the old form and the new, and how Dog Soldiers is an extremely on-the-wet-nose adaptation of the phrase the Dogs of War, which describes both the literal conflict between two warring parties, but also the directly opposed elements of chaos and structure that war itself somehow manages to combine. And the pressure is turned up by the fact that the host always finds themselves in an inescapable conundrum. By the time that they've come to understand what they are, and might be capable of coming up with some solution, they've almost always already committed unspeakable, unforgivable acts, and therefore any solution that they might invent, for instance chaining themselves to a tree such as in the 2014 vampire comedy What We Do in the Shadows, is crude and homemade and liable to failure at around the point that the third act begins, inevitably resulting in the dark side breaking free and enacting a series of vile and inhuman crimes. But sometimes there's a different side to the beast. Despite practically everything that I've said so far, the wolf isn't always a carelessly bellicose being. In one of the most famous historical cases of alleged lycanthropy, Theus of Coutenbrunn was spared after confessing to werewolfism in 1692, as he claimed to travel to hell 3 times a year in order to battle the devil and his witches, fighting to take back the livestock and grain that the evil ones had stolen from the people of Earth. And whilst there aren't as many fiction stories of werewolves with good intentions quite like these, we're all aware of the idea of the beast who can't quite kill the woman that the host is in love with, or the wolf who's hindered by the host's ability to retain some sort of control. These semblances of humanity add a complexity to the wolf themselves, and instead of simply positioning the two figures as dichotomized and constantly at odds, find some space between the human and the animal, between sympathy and villainy, protagonist and antagonist, order and chaos, girl and woman, and the New Age American and the old-timey folklore of the United Kingdom. And whilst I do enjoy it when those things are forever in conflict, I also like to see this collapsing of binary oppositions in the werewolf genre. The Derridean werewolf, if you will. They are, after all, not simply a monster, and it makes sense that their murderous animalistic side would work in some minor level of cooperation with their human side, especially as said animalistic side features the characteristics of a wolf, which is a much smarter animal than if they were a were-rabbit, or slug. They are bound to the same body as the human side, and that side is in control most of the time, so it benefits the wolf to avoid eating their loved ones, etc. Nonetheless, I also appreciate the brutal tragedy of someone being haplessly bound to a bloodthirsty wolf form with no regard for their personal life or sense of morality. It raises the stakes if there really is no controlling this beast, and makes the host into just as much of a victim, with just as much chance of having their loved ones mauled and murdered, as any of the angry townspeople in the story. That said, the trope that the werewolf will either kill/alienate their loved ones, or die in an effort to be with them is great, but can also feel a little tired. King Kong came out 89 years ago now, and unless there's some interesting variations on those motifs, then they can become unfortunately predictable. Thus, whether you're using the sheer unstoppable force of the unflinching inhuman werewolf, or the character whose killer and humane traits meet in the middle, it's important to create something interesting out of those ideas. That could be through tying these plights to similar struggles in the real and natural world, or through intentionally subverting the established patterns of werewolf fiction. But the werewolf character has to be displaying some inner conflict or motion, or you might as well just use any old monster. A word to be wise though, if you do decide to go all allegorical with your werewolf, please make sure that the metaphor actually tracks. because otherwise you'll end up with something that feels messy and ill-fitting, and could easily be misconstrued. Take, for instance, the rather subtly named Professor Remus Lupin from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Rowling has spoken about his lycanthropy as a metaphor for HIV/AIDS, seemingly including it in the novels as a means of destigmatizing the virus. Unfortunately, I personally feel like it suffers here, because it doesn't even seem to fit as well as a square peg in a round hole, let alone to make any kind of substantial point. What I mean here is that the depiction of lycanthropy is hardly akin to any of the points that you can make about the stigmatization and intentional disregarding of a virus predominantly associated with gay men. Like, it's not as though everyone knows about his lycanthropy and just ignores it whilst he slowly perishes at the front of the class, and associating the contracting of HIV with the transformation into a bloodthirsty monster is probably not a helpful method of destigmatizing it. Compare that to the confusion and scary physical and emotional changes that you might have felt yourself undergoing throughout puberty, especially given that Ginger Snaps explicitly ties the condition to Ginger's first period, which marks the start of, again, a scary, bloody and stigmatized change to her life that she's reminded of on roughly the same cycle as that of the full moon. To me, there's no debating which one tracks more effectively, and that's why you've got to think your werewolf allegory through if you ever get round to applying one. Also, why is the guy who knows he's a werewolf who must take a very specific potion to prevent himself from going on a murderous rampage every full moon a f***ing school teacher? Young children live here. It's like he wants something terrible to happen. Now, your zombies and your mummies and your witches and your vampires and your ghosts may all have defining physical features, but all of them more or less just look like people for the majority of the time. Grey people, toilet paper people, people with a wart on their nose, excessively white people, and of course, translucent people. Werewolves, however, are turning into flippin' wolves, so they need a little more than a pair of fangs or some crafty editing to show off their stuff. For many werewolf fans, myself included, the first and perhaps foremost element of their physical form, challenging even the final design of the werewolf itself, is the transformation. Of course, this moment is iconic for a number of reasons, usually setting off the second or third act of a standalone story and giving filmmakers the chance to express themselves in graphic detail. But it's also the perfect scene in which to bring all of the conflicts and collisions that I mentioned earlier to the fore. The panic and confusion of the hosts as they realise that they are transforming, the passing of the baton from the human host to the animal instincts that their personality is juxtaposed against, and perhaps most importantly, the frickin' cool special effects. Now, for each of these reasons, I prefer the transformation to be painful and unnatural and either on screen itself or depicted through dramatic methods that still demonstrate how terrible and terrifying it is. The transmogrification, in my mind, should not be clean, simple, or easy. Again, what's the point if it's not a nightmare for everyone involved? Why use a werewolf at all if they're just going to have a lovely time? This is why I'm a big fan of examples such as those in Company of Wolves, and the transmutations that were clearly inspired by Company of Wolves in Hemlock Grove. They're horrifying and sickening to all, including, it would seem, the werewolf themselves. Perhaps the most highly regarded werewolf transformation is that from An American Werewolf in London, which is certainly a top quality take on the scene by my standards. David's agony and confusion have really set the bar, particularly as a number of stunning practical effects really demonstrate the qualities that modern film technologies can bring to the table. Yet to my mind, there aren't too many quality werewolf transformations that employ CGI. Maybe this is because the werewolf film as a genre is a lot less popular right now than it once was, or maybe it's because it's difficult to express the pain and textures of a werewolf, something with a lot of fur and a very physical, real sense of being, in CGI, which can infamously lack depth and make things too shiny and seem intangible and alien. And when I think of both the classic werewolf transformations old and the better modern examples, all seem to use the older methods. The transformation in recent Marvel film Werewolf by Night was really good because it largely focused on either the shadow of the man being transformed and the screams that accompanied that, or the faces of those reacting to his metamorphosis. The one in Late Phases uses some awesome practical effects, merely supplemented by small amounts of CGI, to bring us perhaps the most memorable scene of its kind from the 2010s. and the admittedly not lupine but still very much werewolfish transformation in The Curse of the Were-Rabbit deftly used his claymation to be able to craft any desired image of lunar-based alteration whilst also retaining the physical presence and realism of practical effects. Even the aforementioned CGI-based Hemlock Grove scenes are heavily reliant upon visceral practical effects, such as Peter's eyes and teeth dropping to the floor midway through the change. The predominantly CGI examples in Doctor Who episode Tooth and Claw and the film adaptation of The Prisoner of Azkaban are perhaps two of the very best that are that reliant upon computer-generated imagery, and even they are really just fine. Both flattering to deceive in my mind because they each deliver nicely on what surely has to be the final stage of any werewolf transformation, an animalistic howling at the moon accompanied by the full reveal of the form of the beast. So there are four main types of werewolf, physically speaking: the natural, the classic, the chonky, and the missing link. The natural, boring. The classic. Now, this is an interesting one, because whereas I'd normally expect the humanity of the monster to develop over time as the genre became more nuanced, the Werewolf of London style hairy fella in a suit still stands as the perfect midpoint between human and beast. Born out of simply being the best representation of an upright wolfman that could be conjured up in the mid-1930s, this design still stands as the best for those stories in which the barriers between the binary oppositions presented by lycanthropy are broken down. This was explored in recent Marvel monster movie Werewolf by Night, in which the werewolf ends up involved in a monster hunting ceremony. This film does a lot of harking back to old school werewolf films, particularly in the design, which so closely resembles the Wolfman of the Universal Classic Monsters franchise that primarily ran from 1931 to 1956. In the 2022 film, we know that he is one of the werewolves for whom the barrier between human and animal is not so certain, as he notes that there was once a time when the werewolf was able to remember, understand, and maintain the emotional attachments of his human form. He refused to kill a friend then, and gonna put a major spoilers sign up here for the duration of the spoilers, he also refrains from attacking his friends on the occasion shown, demonstrating how his physical similarities to his human form reflect the human form's ability to exercise a limited degree of control over the wolf. This ties into the design and its close resemblance to the more sympathetic wolfmen of the early days of horror-based feature films in another way though. Because in Werewolf by Night, the monster hunters that trap the werewolf and force him to transform into his wolf form are all experienced in the ways of monster killing, and barely bat an eyelid, for instance, at the emergence of Man-Thing, a nigh-on immortal coagulation of swamp trash that is cursed with sentience by the soul of a dying man and involuntarily secretes a lethal corrosive upon making contact with someone experiencing negative emotions. Yet they are all visibly horrified by the emergence of the Wolfman, who kind of just looks like a hairy dude. Now, I'm not criticizing this. In fact, I think it's brilliant. Something so close to being human, so much so that for the majority of its life it is human, is bound to disturb these people. They live in a black and white world, and I'm not referring to the film's old school aesthetic here, in which monsters are merely animals and animals are below humans. These beasts are seen as nothing but violent pests, yet before them they see something that shatters that, not only calling into question the morality of their actions in a Macbethian out-damned spot fashion that paints them as closer to the monsters that are simultaneously being painted as closer to them, but also presenting the very real terror of a new threat that is more powerful than they can ever be. They, these humans, are used to killing monsters who are less intelligent, a lot clumsier, and with many more established weaknesses than them. The Wolfman, however, draws perhaps its most horrendous characteristics from the human. He is cunning, agile, enraged, and killing without reason or rhyme. Add to that his superhuman strength, wolf-like hunting ability, and other enhanced powers, and you'll find that this is a foe far greater than anything that they've encountered thus far. They may have killed dozens of monsters each, but this monster is capable of killing dozens of them, precisely because of the strengths that are unique to a werewolf, and should therefore be highlighted in this fashion where possible. The Chonky. Personally not a fan of the man in a big fluffy fursuit approach. Some of the best werewolf films have used this, but I don't think that they're ever going to seem that real, let alone terrifying. A hairy guy in makeup has the benefit of expressions and humanity, and the CGI wolves can look a lot more animalistic and, at least in theory, like real expressive flesh-craving animals. But a big stiff rubber wolf face on a 2-meter Bigfoot costume just doesn't butter any parsnips, I'm afraid. The missing link. I've called this one the missing link because it's barely upright and often feels like the halfway point between the natural wolf and the classic wolfman. For me, this might be the best, or at least my personal favourite, in terms of werewolves that fulfill their potential as unstoppable supernatural beasts. I find that this works best for incarnations in which the wolf is entirely separate from the man, and in which its ferocity is matched only by its status as an apex predator. This is a creature capable of stalking the night, of tearing through people and livestock, and of striking terror into entire communities. It's not wolf, and it's not man, but a nightmarish combination of the two that is unleashed every 4 weeks. And for me, it typifies the idea of a supernatural animal that can only be killed with silver. It has the prowess and inevitability of a xenomorph from the first Alien film, not the ones where they get killed easily for no reason, and has lent itself to other monsters since it became a popular design. For instance, the future predator from Primeval, which is shown to be a quadruped at the pinnacle of evolution, not only able to effectively and terrifyingly hunt humans through the woods, but also showing what would actually happen if a werewolf story were allowed to expand beyond one simple perpetrator, as the lore suggests that they should, by eradicating humanity entirely. Simply put, I think that this is the coolest of the werewolf designs, and the one that's been aided the most by the developments of CGI in the past couple of decades in particular, though it also has its roots in the ferocious fiends of dog soldiers and of course the quadrupedal brute of an American werewolf in London. If you're creating a werewolf story that focuses on the contrast between a host who'd never want to hurt anyone and a beast that lives solely for violence, and if you're trying to create something that could re-inject the horror that was once felt at the mere mention of a werewolf, although again preferably blunted by the modern knowledge that this is all just fiction, I personally believe that this is the best of the designs that we've seen so far, and the most capable of bringing about a new era of werewolf horror. Thank you for watching today's video. I kind of lost track of what I was doing a few times, but maybe you have some ideas on what you think makes a great werewolf. Do you also feel that we haven't had as many great depictions of werewolves as the history of both the monster and the genre deserve? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll make sure to reply to each and every one. This whole thing was initially just going to be like a 5-minute video about the transformation in Werewolf by Night, but then I realised how much there was to talk about, and honestly I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. So please feel free to contribute to this discussion however you are able. Anyway, I really do appreciate each and every one of you who makes it this far into my videos, and also everyone who's subscribed or liked a video or keeps coming back for more, so thanks again, and I hope to see you next time.